The phone buzzed 3 times on the nightstand, and 3 times Marcus watched her name light up the screen and fade into silence. He didn't pick up. He told himself he wasn't ready. He told himself he needed more time. But the truth, the ugly, quiet truth he buried under layers of pride and pain, was that he was afraid. Afraid of what she might say, afraid of what he might hear in her voice, and most of all, afraid that if he heard her cry, he would break all over again, and this time, he wasn't sure he'd be able to put himself back together. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds, hit that like button right now, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that moves your soul. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We truly want to know. Marcus Calloway was 31 years old, lived alone in a modest apartment on the 3rd floor of a gray building on the quieter side of the city, and had spent the better part of the last 4 months convincing himself that silence was the same as healing. He was wrong, of course. Silence is never healing when the wound is still open. But he was stubborn in the way that only truly heartbroken people can be, the kind of stubborn that mistakes numbness for strength and avoidance for wisdom. He and Serena had been together for almost 3 years. 3 years of shared mornings and midnight conversations, of road trips with no destinations and arguments that always ended in forgiveness. They had built something that felt, to both of them, like the kind of love that doesn't come twice in a lifetime. But 4 months ago, a single night, a single misunderstanding that cascaded into harsh words and slammed doors, had shattered what they built. And Marcus, instead of staying and fighting for what was real, had walked away. Not because he stopped loving her, but because his pride was louder than his heart that night, and by the time it quieted down, too many days had passed and too many silences had hardened between them like concrete. He had thought about calling her back every single day since. He had picked up the phone 100 times. He had typed her name into a message box and stared at the empty text field until his eyes blurred. But every time, something stopped him. Some invisible wall that was made entirely of ego and fear. And he would set the phone down, pour himself another cup of cold coffee, and stare out his window at the city below, wondering if she thought about him the way he thought about her, constantly, helplessly, like breathing, involuntary, necessary, and completely out of his control. That night, the night of the 3rd missed call, was a Tuesday in February. The kind of cold, gray Tuesday that feels like the universe has decided to match your interior weather. Marcus had come home from work exhausted, eaten half a sandwich over the sink, and collapsed onto the couch still wearing his coat. He had been staring at the ceiling for nearly an hour when the phone buzzed the first time. He saw her name, Serena, and felt his chest do something complicated and painful, like a hand reaching in and squeezing. He let it ring out. The second call came 7 minutes later. He picked the phone up, turned it over in his hands, felt the vibration against his palm like a pulse, and set it face down on the cushion beside him. He told himself she probably just wanted to talk about the box of her things still sitting in his hallway closet, the one he couldn't bring himself to drop off or throw away. He told himself it was probably practical, logistical. He told himself it wasn't what his heart desperately hoped it was. The third call came at 11:45 at night. By then, Marcus had moved to his bedroom, changed out of his coat, and was lying in the dark with his arm over his eyes. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he watched the glow of her name pulse against the ceiling like a signal from somewhere very far away. He didn't move. He didn't reach for it. He just breathed, counted the buzzes, and then listened to the silence that followed. And in that silence, he felt something he hadn't felt in months, not peace, not relief, but a kind of hollow guilt that settled in his chest like stones. He was still awake at midnight when the knock came at his door. It was 3 quiet, deliberate knocks. Not aggressive, not desperate. Just 3 knocks. measured, careful, as if the person on the other side was equally afraid of what was waiting on this side of the door. Marcus sat up in bed. For a long, strange moment, he didn't move. He thought perhaps he'd imagined it. His apartment building had 12 units, and noise traveled in odd ways at night. But then the knock came again, the same 3 measured beats, and he felt his entire body go still in a way that had nothing to do with calm. He walked to the door in the dark, not turning on any lights, as if somehow the darkness would protect him from whatever truth was waiting on the other side. He looked through the peephole, and the air left his body completely. Serena was standing in the hallway in her long green coat, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face tilted slightly downward. She was not crying. She was not pounding on the door or making a scene. She was simply standing there, holding herself very still, the way people do when they're trying to hold something together on the inside. Marcus stood frozen with his hand on the doorknob for what felt like an entire lifetime. His heart was hammering so loudly he was certain she could hear it through the door. Every excuse, every wall, every piece of silence he had built over 4 months was pressing against him from the inside, and somehow, in this moment, none of it felt like protection anymore. All of it felt like a prison. He turned the handle and opened the door. They looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. Serena's eyes were very dark and very serious, and there was something in them that Marcus had never quite seen before, something past the usual fire and warmth, something older and quieter. She had been crying recently, he could tell. Not the active, visible kind, but the kind that leaves its evidence around the eyes long afterward, like watermarks. She didn't apologize for coming. She didn't explain herself immediately or launch into the conversation he had been imagining and dreading for months. She just looked at him, and in a voice very soft and very steady, she said something that cut right through every wall he had built. Not because the words were dramatic or perfectly chosen, but because they were simply and devastatingly true. She told him she hadn't come to argue. She hadn't come to ask him to take her back or to relitigate the night everything fell apart. She had come because she'd received a phone call that evening from her older brother Theo, who lived 3 states away, telling her that their father had been admitted to the hospital with a cardiac event, and the prognosis was uncertain, and she needed to drive the 5 hours to be there, and she hadn't been able to make herself get in the car alone. She had called Marcus 3 times, not because she thought she had the right to ask anything of him, but because when the worst thing happens, the mind and the heart go to the person they trust most before they go anywhere else. And despite everything, despite the silence and the distance and the months of not speaking, she still trusted Marcus more than anyone else in the world. She hadn't known where else to go. Something inside Marcus cracked open so completely and so quietly that he barely heard it happen. He stepped back from the door. He told her to come in. He told her he would drive. The drive to her family's city took just over 5 hours through the dark and the cold, down long highway stretches where the only light came from their headlights and the occasional flicker of a passing truck. Serena sat in the passenger seat with her knees drawn up and her hands wrapped around a thermos of tea that Marcus had made without asking while she was sitting on his couch. She didn't sleep, but she didn't talk much either. Neither did he. The silence between them this time was different from the silence of the past 4 months. It wasn't cold or protective or constructed out of pride. It was the kind of silence that old friends and deep loves can share, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because the presence itself is the message. Somewhere around the 2nd hour, Serena rested her head against the cold window and told him about the last time she had seen her father. A visit in October, before everything had gone wrong between her and Marcus, before the autumn had turned into this long gray winter. She described the way her father had walked her to her car when she was leaving, the way he had hugged her longer than usual, as if he somehow knew there would be long stretches of not seeing ahead. She told the story quietly, without falling apart, and Marcus listened the way he should have listened during their relationship, with his whole attention and no part of himself checking out, no part building a defense or waiting for his turn to speak. He thought about how strange and terrible it is that it sometimes takes grief to dissolve the barriers that pride builds. He thought about how he had spent 4 months protecting himself from exactly this, from this closeness, from this realness, from the particular vulnerability of caring about someone so much that their pain becomes physically present in your own chest. He had thought that walking away was self-preservation. He understood now, somewhere on a dark highway at 2 in the morning, that it had actually been the opposite. That he had been slowly withering in all those silent evenings alone, and that what he had called healing had actually been a kind of slow going dim. They arrived at the hospital just after 5 in the morning. Serena's mother, a small woman named Rosalind with steady eyes and silver-streaked hair, met them in the waiting room. She held her daughter for a long time without speaking, and then she looked at Marcus over Serena's shoulder with an expression that contained an entire conversation, gratitude and recognition, and something that might have been gentle reproach, as in, "You should not have stayed away so long." Marcus received it without flinching. He deserved it, and he knew it. Serena's father, a tall and quiet man named Edwin, who had always reminded Marcus of a lighthouse, steady and a little solitary and immensely useful in a storm, was stable by morning. The cardiac event had been serious, but not catastrophic, and the doctors spoke in careful, measured tones about treatment plans and recovery timelines and the importance of rest. When Serena was allowed to go in and see him, Marcus stayed in the waiting room with Rosalind and drank terrible hospital coffee and felt, for the first time in 4 months, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Theo arrived mid-morning, tall and serious with his sister's same dark eyes, and he shook Marcus's hand with a grip that communicated more than words. By afternoon, Edwin was awake and alert, complaining mildly about the hospital food and asking about the football scores with the particular energy of a man reasserting his own life in small ways. Serena sat beside his bed, holding his hand, and Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment before she saw him and moved over slightly, just slightly, to make room. Not asking, not explaining, just making room. The way you do for someone who belongs. They stayed 2 more days. Marcus called his office, rearranged what needed rearranging, and didn't think twice about it. He slept on a cot in the family's hotel room and drove Rosalind to the pharmacy and sat with Serena in the hospital cafeteria at odd hours of the night while she processed everything she was feeling in the slow, circular way that people process things they can't quite believe. He listened. He didn't offer solutions or silver linings. He just stayed present, which was all she had ever needed from him, and which he now understood with a clarity that felt almost painful, was the one thing he had often withheld during their relationship out of some misguided instinct toward self-protection. On the second evening, when Edwin was doing well enough for the family to begin relaxing, Serena and Marcus took a walk around the hospital grounds. A small garden area that was bare in February, but still had wooden benches and a stone path and a kind of dignified quietness about it. They walked for a while without speaking, and then Serena said something that Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said that she hadn't come to his door that night to ask for anything back. She had come because she was scared and because he was, in the deepest part of her, still home. And she needed to know. Not for a future, not with any expectation, but just to know whether he understood what they had lost, whether the silence of those 4 months had been choice or fear. Marcus stopped walking. He stood in the cold February air with his breath fogging in front of him and looked at the woman who had been the best thing in his life and said the truest thing he had ever said, that it had been fear and that fear had disguised itself as pride so perfectly that he had almost believed it was strength. That walking away had not been a decision made from clarity. It had been a flinch. And he had spent 4 months flinching, alone in his apartment, watching her name light up his screen and putting the phone face down and calling that healing when it was the furthest thing from it. He said he was sorry, not the reflexive, self-protecting kind of sorry, but the kind that comes from genuinely seeing what you did and feeling the full weight of it. Serena was quiet for a long time after that. Then she reached out and took his hand, not romantically, not with any declaration, but the way people hold hands in the dark when the ground feels uncertain, and they walked the rest of the path in that particular silence that is the opposite of emptiness. The kind that is full of everything that's already been said, and everything that still remains to be decided, and all the warm, tentative, terrifying possibility that lives in the space between an ending and a beginning. If this story has touched something in your heart, if it reminded you of someone you love, someone you've missed, or something you've been too proud or too afraid to reach out for, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. Your engagement means the world to this channel and helps these stories reach more people who need them. They drove back to the city 3 days later, early in the morning when the sky was that particular shade of dark blue that exists just before dawn. Not night anymore, but not quite day. Serena drove this time, and Marcus sat in the passenger seat watching the sky shift through blues and then grays, and then the first pale suggestion of gold along the horizon. They had not made any large declarations. They had not made plans. What they had made, quietly and without ceremony, was an agreement to stop being afraid of each other, to stop letting pride speak louder than truth, to begin, slowly and carefully, to find their way back to the thing that had always been real between them, the trust, the recognition, the particular comfort of knowing that someone else understands the language you speak without having to translate it. Marcus thought about the missed calls, those 3 glowing moments where her name had lit up his world and he had looked away. He thought about all the nights he had told himself he wasn't ready, all the mornings he had reached for the phone and pulled his hand back. He understood now that readiness is not a condition that arrives on its own. You do not wake up one day finally prepared to be vulnerable, finally healed enough to love without armor. Readiness is a choice, a terrifying, imperfect, necessary choice, made in the exact moment when fear is loudest and everything in you wants to flinch. It is the choice to pick up the phone anyway, to open the door anyway, to say the true thing even when the safer thing is silence. Edwin would spend 2 weeks in recovery before being discharged. By spring, he would be walking in his garden again and calling Marcus on Sunday afternoons to talk about nothing in particular, football and weather and the stubbornness of certain perennial plants, in the way that fathers talk to the people they've decided to keep. Rosalind would make the same pot of soup every time Marcus and Serena came to visit, a particular recipe involving lentils and rosemary that always smelled to Marcus exactly like being forgiven. And Serena, who had stood at his door at midnight with steady eyes and a heart full of fear she refused to let become cowardice, would one day tell him on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while they were washing dishes together and the radio played something quiet in the background, that the hardest thing she had ever done was make that drive to his building that night, that she had sat in her car outside for 20 minutes before coming up, that she had almost driven away twice. He would ask her what made her get out of the car in the end, and she would look at him with those dark, serious eyes and say simply that she decided the truth was worth more than her pride, and that she had learned it from watching him let his pride cost him everything. He would hear that and feel it land in him like something coming home. Before the final word, drop a comment right now that says, "I choose love over pride," if this story moved you. Let's fill the comment section with courage. Some of the most important moments of a life don't arrive with fanfare. They arrive at midnight in the form of 3 quiet knocks on a door you've been keeping locked out of habit and fear. They arrive in the voice of someone you love, steadier than you expected, asking not for everything but for the one true thing, your presence, your honesty, the courage to stop running from what is real. Marcus Calloway learned this the hard way, in the gray February cold, on a hospital bench in a city that was not his own, holding the hand of a woman he had almost let his silence consume. He learned that love is not destroyed by arguments or distance or even months of mutual stubborn silence. Love is destroyed by the decision, made quietly, repeated daily, to choose fear over truth. And love is restored the same way, quietly, imperfectly, one honest moment at a time. He had avoided her calls. And she had come to his door anyway, not because she needed him to be perfect, not because she had forgiven everything already, but because she was brave enough to believe that real things, the truly real things, are worth the knock. All you have to do is open the door. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to remember that it's not too late.